Nintendo has shadow dropped a new mobile game, Fire Emblem Shadows, a free-to-start experience, and while at some point I want to circle back to look at their mobile strategy more comprehensively, at this point I just wanted to give a few initial thoughts on the new game and what this might mean for Nintendo's broader approach to these kinds of titles. The game is designed as being part of the, air quotes, real-time tactics and treachery genre. And while I've never seen treachery as a genre before, it seems like they're trying to make their own Among Us style game using Fire Emblem as the core franchise to do it, which is pretty smart given the success of those kinds of games. The blurb says, the gameplay of Fire Emblem Shadows combines real-time strategy and social deduction. One of the three allies participating in each battle is secretly a treacherous disciple of Shadow. Players choose to take on the role of either a disciple of light, aiming to find their way through the labyrinth, or a disciple of shadow. After the initial battle, players vote to determine who they believe is the treacherous disciple of shadow. The outcome of the vote affects whether the next battle is more favorable or more challenging. Whether the disciples of light can correctly discover the traitor or the disciple of shadow can successfully deceive the others holds the key to how the next battle unfolds. End quote. Okay, so let's talk about Nintendo's strategy with all of this. To begin with, it's interesting that this is the first substantial new mobile app that's actually a game for some time, and that it seems that they've really been giving some thought to innovating with the format and bringing a new concept to the table in terms of gameplay with the whole Shadow format and Among Us style approach. Even Pikmin Bloom arguably was an activity app as much as it was a game. But of course, if there's one title in Nintendo's wheelhouse that really made it big in the mobile space, it is Fire Emblem Heroes, which comfortably has earned more than even Nintendo's biggest tentpole franchises on mobile like Mario and Animal Crossing. The game has reportedly hit $1 billion in player spending, which would be the equivalent of selling 17 million copies of a $60 title, and while Nintendo will have fees for Apple and Google as they don't own those platforms they're using to distribute Heroes, retail games also have distribution costs as well. In profitability terms, therefore, if you put Fire Emblem Heroes into the list of biggest Switch sellers for comparison, it would fall outside the top 10, but probably be well into the top 20. However, what's crucial here is that this is a franchise that in the past has been a real also-ran for Nintendo, Fire Emblem. Even today, when Nintendo talk about their top franchises and key IP, they list 9 different franchises. Pikmin is mentioned, Donkey Kong is mentioned, Metroid is mentioned, but Fire Emblem is always left out. However, it seems to me that if they can replicate the profitability of Awakening with Fire Emblem Shadow, then perhaps subsequent mobile games as well, then Fire Emblem may in fact prove to be more successful for the company in the mobile space than as a series of core RPGs. Of course, the whole point of Nintendo's mobile strategy, as Nintendo are always insisting, is to drive people towards their core hardware-software lineup, and so the timing of this announcement does make a lot of sense considering the imminent release of Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave. They will hope to build a big new audience for Shadows, built of people who previously and currently played Fire Emblem Heroes and who might be interested in trying the new app. And those people will doubtless find that there will be cross-promotion of content relevant to Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave as the release of that game approaches. Now, Nintendo has had some success with this kind of early promotion twice before. Pikmin Bloom led to a blooming of sales for Pikmin when Pikmin 4 set records for the franchise, and of course the first Fire Emblem app came a couple of months before Fire Emblem Shadows of Valentia launched on 3DS, and was meant to be the year before Fire Emblem Three Houses released, although ultimately Three Houses was pushed back into 2019. Valentia wasn't a major seller in the scheme of things, but it outsold the original despite being a late-in-life 3DS title, and once Heroes was better established, it cleared the way for Fire Emblem Three Houses to become the franchise's biggest selling title, with over 4.12 million copies sold, reportedly as of late 2022. The positioning of this new app seems to coincide with a broader coordinated push on Fire Emblem to give the next game its best possible chance. In the case of Pikmin, though, there was a little more to the strategy than just the app and the game. For one thing, we had the re-release of Pikmin 1 plus 2, and it seems plausible to me that we could have other kinds of game re-releases. Recall the limited edition release of Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light back in 2020. Just as Super Mario Galaxy was a limited release in 2020 that has now resurfaced in 2025, bringing back that game perhaps to Nintendo Switch Online may make some sense, although of course this would only be relevant to the West, as my understanding is that the game is available for Nintendo Classics in Japan. Now, I've speculated in the past that just as the expansion pack is the premier tier of Nintendo Switch Online, Nintendo may one day want to make a base tier of Nintendo Switch Online that serves primarily mobile customers. Nintendo Music could be a step towards that, but in terms of servicing access to Nintendo Classics, making a Fire Emblem game mobile accessible could be a very enticing step for the large install base of those classic games. Let's say they added Gaiden to NSO, but also made a small section of Famicom titles playable on mobile alongside Nintendo Music as the launch of a new mobile-focused service. The games wouldn't make such a big impact in Japan, as I understand that most of the early Japanese-only Fire Emblems are already available to play on Nintendo Switch Online, but while it seems hard to find reliable information, I can't see that Gaiden is, and so this seems to me a more plausible option. Obviously in the West, there's far more scope to do a big Fire Emblem splash as well, since they have these games that they could translate, but this would be a relatively costly endeavour, and frankly, if they follow the Pikmin playbook, they were really far more exercised about making Pikmin a major regional phenomenon, with Pikmin paraphernalia of all sorts available in Japan. If they try to replicate this moment with Fire Emblem, they will probably aim to focus their primary attention on the single region where Fire Emblem is strongest. Though I can find no sales data, I've seen it stated that Japan is the largest market for Heroes, and this makes sense despite the relative size of the US population compared to Japan's. Of course, long rumoured by Nate the Hate has been the presence of a Fire Emblem 4 remake for the original Nintendo Switch, and there's some logic perhaps to having a dual release of Switch and Switch 2 titles, given the massive Switch install base and the fact that Fire Emblem has always skewed towards being a handheld-focused series over the years. Yes, Nintendo want to graduate people to Switch 2, and Fortune's Weave is clearly a major title that shows off the graphical powers of the new system, but perhaps having an adaptation of an older title could capitalize on that hype cycle. The difficulty is that while Pikmin games are relatively short experiences, a Fire Emblem title feels more likely to stand on the toes of Fortune's Weave, especially in the West, where the game would play as new. Nintendo has dropped remakes on a prior console to complement a big new game on their mainline one before now, though. Just this year, we had Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, followed by Donkey Kong Bonanza, while Luigi's Mansion on 3DS preceded the Luigi's Mansion 3 announcement for Switch in 2018, released of course in 2019. The question is, does having a secondary title amplify momentum for the main game or disrupt it? On balance, if Fortune's Weave were scheduled for later in the year, say a July game, the same slot that did so well for Three Houses and Xenoblade Chronicles 3, then shadow dropping a title in the run-up might be helpful, perhaps, let's say at the February Direct, a bit like the way that Metroid Prime Remaster was shadow dropped. After all, it's not like most players don't have other Fire Emblem titles to buy if they wanted to try the series, so it's mainly going to draw the attention of the huge number of fans keen for the next title, but desperate for their Fire Emblem fix in the meantime. Of course, there could be another Switch game that's not a re-release in that time. Just as they experimented with the treachery mechanic for Fire Emblem Shadows, I wouldn't rule out Nintendo doing some kind of experimental side game with the series. Perhaps even some DLC for Tokyo Mirage Sessions to try to position that for another period in the sun, although that game seems unlikely to return. While people are in the mood for Fire Emblem though, the thinking would go, try to upsell them on as much Fire Emblem content as possible. Then again, Nintendo have a simpler path to doing this, the release of Fire Emblem Path of Radiance onto the GameCube Classics app. This is probably the best move as it graduates their keen Fire Emblem fans to their regular subscription service and ensures that people get exposed not just to Fire Emblem but to a breadth of other Nintendo content at the same time. That option wasn't really available for Pikmin in 2023 as there were no Classics apps that had a Pikmin title, but we know for a fact that the Fire Emblem game is going to be coming to GameCube Nintendo Switch Online. It's only a matter of whether they use it specifically in advance of Fortune's Weave or wait until afterwards. Another option Nintendo will have for the hype cycle of Fortune's Weave is to discontinue Fire Emblem Heroes and sell it as a complete version. On the one hand, this is a huge risk, and I can understand why Nintendo would want to launch Shadows before making any such move. You don't just retire a game that's clearly been a huge success for them. But from what I can gather, the game has had 9 so-called books, each containing multiple chapters, and the last one seemed to have a strong sense of finality. I guess they won't make any move on Heroes until they see how Shadows performs, but if momentum is good for the new app, and they can bring a lot of people over to Shadows quite quickly to experience the next new content, the next option after that would make sense is to do what they did with Animal Crossing Pocket Camp and sell a complete version of the game in its final form. Beyond simply being good practice for games of this sort to sell a final edition, it also is a great way to continue monetizing the game indefinitely when they're not creating new content for it. I'm not quite sure what they'd charge, but I guess it would be more than the $20 they charge for Pocket Camp, since by all accounts, Heroes does have a huge amount of content to it. While I do expect this to be a Japan-focused title, the fact that Shadows will be gearing up as the next Mario movie approaches does make me wonder if they will use the opportunity to cross-promote the title there using trailers and such like, at least in Japan. Although Mario and Fire Emblem might feel like a slightly odd blend, I imagine there'll be plenty of parents taking children along to the Mario film who might be more in the category of gamer who mess about with their phones rather than sit down with a dedicated console, and so this could be a good outreach timing. They also get to test run the success of this strategy with the Mario movie, which potentially is less of a rich seam of potential players for them, before rolling out the potentially bigger campaign alongside Zelda, whereas the aesthetics of that universe at least are more consistent with Fire Emblems. Now, the release of this mobile game opens up other possibilities concerning Nintendo's use of mobile to support key titles. It's obviously not a one-size-fits-all strategy that they pair mobile and mainline releases, and it's perhaps worth considering why games like Fire Emblem and Pikmin seem to have suited this strategy, while other relatively niche titles Nintendo have put considerable effort into reviving recently, franchises like Metroid and Donkey Kong haven't benefited from a mobile strategy to complement the mainline releases. Knowing Nintendo, this could well be as simple as that they didn't find a mobile gameplay mechanic that they liked sufficiently to pursue, but it may also be a determination about the kinds of people who play the different kinds of games and how likely they are to be mobile players as well, or at least to be brought over from mobile onto the consoles. In this sense, the series that seems the likeliest to have a mobile complement going forward is Animal Crossing, given that Pocket Camp was, while never a massive hit, relatively successful for Nintendo's mobile offerings and quite long running. What this probably doesn't mean is that we will see any grand revival of the mobile strategy from Nintendo more holistically. Sorry to Dragalia Lost fans, but I don't think this indicates any major change on that series' retirement for the time being. Finally, a word about the promotion of the various Nintendo franchises at the moment. I mentioned in previous videos that it seems to me that Nintendo are making a particular push to highlight their second-tier franchises around the launch of the Switch 2. Sure, we've got multiple Mario titles, several Pokemon games on the slate, and a Zelda spin-off, as well as the re-releases of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. But the most eye-catching games in many respects are Metroid Prime 4, Kirby Air Riders, Donkey Kong Bonanza, and now Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, with Splatoon Raiders also already confirmed. I feel like it's only a matter of time before Nintendo announce more for Pikmin, though perhaps they'll wait until the Fire Emblem hype cycle is played out if they want to put all their efforts onto Fire Emblem for a period of time, especially in Japan. Let's wrap up then with a few forecasts. For anyone new to the channel, I like to quantify my judgments of likelihood with a percentage value as to how likely I feel something is: 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%, or 90%. Then every now and then I look back and check, and hopefully my 10% calls are right 10% of the time, and so on. Feel free to play along in the comments if you'd like to put down your own forecasts, but for now, and for posterity's sake, I'm going to say these. Fire Emblem Shadows to be mentioned in the November presentation feels like a 90% shout. It's very rare for Nintendo not to acknowledge their various new announcements during these financial events, and I will be intrigued to see if Shuntaro Furukawa has anything more to say on the topic, and particularly about the mobile strategy more generally. Fire Emblem Heroes to discontinue by the end of the financial year 2027, so that will be March 2027, and I think this is 50%. They may not be in any rush to discontinue it until the new game is bedded in, but a year and a half is a substantial period, and they may feel that they want to gently ease people onto the new platform, and certainly not have the ongoing costs of maintaining a game with a dwindling support base. Another Fire Emblem console release by the end of March 2027, I think that's 30%. Note here that a re-release of a game such as Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light for sale would count as a new game, but a game added to the Nintendo Switch Online Classics app wouldn't, because that's part of a subscription service and not sold discreetly. Fire Emblem Heroes to be available as a paid-for game by the end of 2029, and I think this is 70%. I've given this a long frame of reference as it seems likely to me that the eventual fate of the game will be as a paid-for app, but the only question is whether the sequel title will be successful enough for Nintendo to cut their ties with such a successful original game, or whether they will decide to keep nurturing Heroes into the future. More Fire Emblem titles on Nintendo Switch Online by the release of Fortune's Weave, and most likely this would be Path of Radiance. I think this is a 70% shout. Path of Radiance seems like a good shout to come, but I'm not putting this as at the highest 90% slot because it depends when Fortune's Weave is released. I could see a May release for Fortune's Weave, followed by Path of Radiance dropped in a June Direct to ride the hype cycle, though I don't think this is the most likely way round for those two games. For other videos on my channel connected to Fire Emblem developers' intelligent systems and the futures of some other Nintendo franchises, do have a look at the videos linked on the screen. Huge thanks as ever to my Patreon supporters, and I shall look forward to seeing you all next time for another Nintendo Forecast.